Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And if you're like me, the past 3 or 4 days have probably been pretty nerve-wracking, and on some level, extremely stupid. Now, there's nothing on the schedule for this week that is really all that political, so you're not gonna hear about it here. But again, if I seem kind of frazzled, or at the very least very tired, that's why. To be frank, you're all very lucky I managed to pull together an episode at all, let alone one as long as this is gonna be. Well, into the madness we all go. This is On the Pulse. So I got 8 albums in the docket. Let's first go back and talk about from Kaatayra, So Quem Viu o Relâmpago a Sua Direita Sabe. Alright, this has been on my schedule for a while. Some Brazilian atmospheric black metal that leans on the folk side, with more layered acoustics and some truly wild blast beat drum work. Honestly, pretty terrific stuff. Reminds me of a wilder panopticon in some of the melodies and the production, albeit perhaps lacking a little bit of that song structure in terms of crescendos and transitions. Now, it's also their 3rd album in 2 years, not counting another one they released already later this year, and it's also really damn good. Now, if it's not obvious enough, I don't speak Portuguese, so I was working off a translation of the lyrics, but I will say that the arc of the content doesn't really surprise me. A call to buck against the lies of bad history and religion, and just the embracing of the inevitability of humanity's end in a certain primal tranquility by the immensity of the silence. And yet, it doesn't quite feel as nihilistic like so much black metal in this lane is. The line that stands out to me on the closing track, once translated, is, "The mood of the absurd is realized," which calls to mind existentialism and Camus, and finding acceptance to live in despite that windswept end, especially if that ending will bring peace. And the 4 compositions we got here support that primal meditation. The guttural vocals are overlaid with chants as waves of bright, fast-picked tremolo acoustics swirl around the crashing and amazingly diverse and textured drum work, really the highlight here. Blended in with what sounds like the Amazon just gives the album such a satisfying texture to really sink into. Even if I would argue that while all 4 of these pieces are melodically satisfying and distinct, they definitely meander over a longer runtime, especially the synth touch closer, and some of the sharper acoustics right at the top of the mix can clip the vibe a little bit. But you know, it's odd. For as much meditative music that I've been lukewarm on in 2020, I've definitely found projects that fit more my taste and have enough that's going to entice me, and this is absolutely one of them. Just some uniquely great folk-tinged atmospheric black metal. 8 out of 10. Definitely recommended. Check it out. Next up from Enslaved, Utgard. Oh, this has been long in coming. Most because this is one of those that got requested by one of my patrons who wanted me to do the homework on one of the few second-wave Norwegian black metal acts that pivoted away from all the bullshit. And you know, going through their early catalog, it's kind of easy to explain why they did. Enslaved were more interested in the rough-edged, historically pagan, and progressive side of that genre. And while that's normally a dog whistle a mile loud, Enslaved actually looks like they did their historical research on Viking mythos, and not what a lot of dipshits are trying to claim it is to this day. So all of that was very promising, and they had a really robust back catalog for me to dig into, and man, I wish I liked more of it. I implied some of this back when I covered Insephirum and how some Viking metal can start to run a little bit stale, but my larger issue with Enslaved is how, while they made some pretty conventionally solid progressive black metal, it always felt a step away from elevating solid to truly great. The early stuff was potent, but leaned a little bit too hard towards thrash for my liking. Their mid-period got tagged with some Opeth worship, but I'd really argue that it often felt searching for any sort of clear identity and any semblance of decent production. And their late-period stuff, well, it's more tuneful, but I won't really say it's all that dynamic or interesting. If I was stuck highlighting my favorites, I'd probably go with when they hit more of a workable balance in terms of their genres, and more of a solid mix, like on Mardrum or Vertebrae or Retir, and you know what, Below the Lights is about as good as everybody says it is. But even then, I would not say that any of these albums are all that stellar or transcendent in black metal or progressive metal. And this project here did not impress me whatsoever. I mean, to describe this as a letdown after the amount of work I put into researching this band is considerable. Because not only did I not find a truly great entry in this catalog, this project in particular, only okay at best, and really for a lot of the same reasons that other Enslaved albums frustrate me. Now, for one, as much as this band is pivoting to embrace more progressive rock elements in a lot of their underwhelming clean vocal harmonies and more spacious, slightly more liquid melodies, they didn't bother to pick up all that much in terms of the way of distinctive melody or hooks, or really any sense of dynamics or atmosphere. Yes, the last of which have been a pretty persistent issue with Enslaved for decades now, but it's all the more glaring here, and very little that breaks free of the chugging monotony of so many of these riffs. Seriously, the bass lines, they're often way more interesting melodically than a lot of the guitar lines, and that's proven on Erjotten, where they try for a heavy and aggressive krautrock groove, and it's probably the most interesting thing on this album. It at least stands out. You can tell they keep trying to add in more arranged passages to build up some bombast or distinctive color, but so much of it falls into a very even and increasingly tedious set of compositions that have limited momentum and pretty much no direction. And even if you're going for the meandering, wandering vibe, which is the very mellow closer seems to imply for a lot of the album, you would think some of those highlight solos and stylistic diversions, they were building to something that didn't just merge into a haze of shredding. And I honestly can't say the content really helps here either. Yes, they're going for more abstract pieces to describe venturing into the wild, transcended outlands of Utgard, and then potentially returning having awoken something far darker. But I mean, good luck following that arc from song to song. And look, there's a part of me that does not want to say this is bad. Clearly this band has an audience. They've been going around for a long time, and what's going in this direction, you could predict it. I just question where the hell they placed their roadmap, because this lost me. Strong 5 out of 10. That's generous, and because I know I will not remember much of this. Just saying. Next up from CamelPhat, Dark Matter. Okay, there are electronic albums that I get why people want me to talk about them if they've got a big back catalog, or they're critically acclaimed, or they deserve more in-depth attention. All that makes sense. CamelPhat, meanwhile, is a relatively mainstream accessible deep house act that's pretty big in the UK, and also very reliant on guest stars, and I'm wondering why on earth anybody is all that interested in me talking about it. Yes, it's their debut album, but this is an act that's been releasing singles under their own name since 2010. They aren't really an album act, and indeed this project has singles on it spanning back to 2017. So okay, fine, like a lot of electronic albums in this lane, it's more of a singles collab. And man, if that was supposed to convince me that their lukewarm, very clean, generally fizzy house cuts are interesting in aggregate, they did not succeed whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying the mixes from CamelPhat don't sound well balanced or rich. For the most part, the percussion especially sounds really damn good, but when it comes to their buzzy synth choices, a lot of these melodies are so underweight and so faded that these songs just kind of wash over me, leaving very little impact from the instrumentals, especially on the purely instrumental cuts. And let's not pretend like the lyrics have much worth mentioning whatsoever here. But okay, you treat it like a singles compilation. What are the standouts, for good or ill? Well, Full shows up on Hypercolor for the smoky synthwave vibe. I was a bit surprised that I liked the misty feel and texture percussion touches on Dance With My Ghost and Cola with Elderbrook. Then Lowe's brings a bit of a Florence Welsh vibe on Easier and Wildfire, and I like that. And for a more delicate cut, Jem Cook sounds really nice on the glittery keys of Carry Me Away. And you know, that might seem like a lot of songs that I just highlighted, but there's 21 songs on this project and it's nearly 90 minutes. And when it lacks so much unique personality, yeah, you know what, it's not the debut I think anybody might have been hoping for. Strong 5 out of 10, only for house fans at best, and frankly, they've heard better. Next up from Cam, The Others.
Wedding band, I'd rather you hate me than not understand. Oh, Diane.
Now, okay, this is interesting. Honestly, kind of stunned it took this long for Cam to put out a new album, but it turns out there were reasons for it. Some of this looks to be a case of label mismanagement and future singles not really catching fire, which blows my mind because there was a solid 4 or 5 cuts off of Untamed that could have been money even on Nashville radio if they were promoted properly beyond Burning House. But that meant she got spun off from Arista Nashville. She signed with 30 Tigers while still being under RCA, and while she tried to put a nice spin on a pretty long development time, the list of co-writers and collaborators might indicate a bit of an identity crisis here, even in pop country. Seriously, on the one hand, you've got Natalie Hemby and Laurie McKenna. On the other hand, you have Jack Antonoff, Jeff Basker, Sam Smith, and Harry Styles. And I'll say it, that mashup of styles definitely manifests across a lot of this album. And a lot of the synth-touched acoustic swells, the borderline millennial whooping in the backing vocals, the thicker low ends, not quite as overweight as Untamed, thankfully, and more than a little Fleetwood Mac influence in some of the vocal harmonies, starting to become a common thing. I'm not gonna complain. But like with Untamed, this album spirals into pretty odd territory fast, with the title track being a co-write with the late Avicii, and it might be the best country EDM fusion in composition I have heard in years. Yeah, if you were like me and you just really came around on Untamed just for the creativity and the hooks, and I thought that album was underrated at the time, or you were there for the sharp writing, or Cam just having terrific and underrated pipes, this is an album that steps up in all the right places. It's a real improvement, from the elegant arrangements with just enough muscle to build a love story on Like a Movie, to the irrepressibly chipper classic, getting a bit of a nice Jennifer Nettles vibe there circa 2016, and that's a compliment. From the fantastic sharpness and the detail on changes that pulls no punches in her small town dissection, to the more vivacious 80s inflections on the hookup of Till There's Nothing Left. And then there's Diane, which is framed as the apology from the other girl in Jolene, who now has to reckon with the asshole who seemingly played them both to some extent, and she is feeling guilty. And while I'm normally pretty skeptical in including a song that was originally released in 2017, see my CamelPhat review, but when you got a groove this galloping, this powerful, you do not pass it up. It's on par with My Mistake as her best song to date. It is that fantastic. And you know, while there isn't much of a narrative or a theme running through this album, there are enough songs about reconciling with a pretty hard past to now find some clarity on the comeback, to the point where the final piano ballad is literally her story, co-written by Natalie Hemby. And you know what? That will provide an emotional resonance and a sense of stakes and drama that actually gives this album a fair bit more weight than you might expect. And in a year that has been this stacked in country, pop leaning or otherwise, I think Cam delivered one hell of a comeback. It's an 8 out of 10. The album's goddamn great. I really had a lot of fun with it. Will be slept on by way too many, and Diane is a monster of a song. Y'all should fix that. Check this out. Next up, from Bring Me the Horizon, Post-Human Survival. Look, I haven't made it much of a secret that I've been on the outside looking in with Bring Me the Horizon for a while now. The fact that a song from Ammo wound up on my year-end list of the best songs of 2019, it was more a complete fluke than any kind of endorsement, and that doesn't even touch the music to listen to thing that dropped near the end of that year. And even this seems like a bit of a weird experiment. Ollie Sykes seems to imply it might be more part of a series of projects, or more like an EP. It's just over half an hour, 9 songs, features collaborations from Youngblood, Baby Metal, and Amy Lee of Evanescence. So there's some experimentation that might be going on here, or in reality, it's just gonna wind up a jumbled blend of their earlier, heavier roots, infused with a lot of the pop sensibility they picked up in recent years. Now, on the surface, that does not seem like a bad idea. It would be considered a whole return to form by the folks who didn't really like the pop pivot, but would also keep the tighter compositional structures, which would be good. But it also means that the lingering issues with both eras of Bring Me the Horizon would roar back to the forefront, and I think that's what's holding me back from liking this as much as so many folks do. For one, it is absolutely bricked out and overmixed, with buzzy and gummy synth layers slammed to the very front in waves in order to support all the chugging riffs, and man, I wish a lot of those riffs had a lot deeper impact. This was an issue on Ammo that hasn't really been fixed here, where the bass, the drums, and the drum machines are just mixed into the whole slurry of sound with little in the way to drive a dynamic groove. And that honestly kind of handicaps just how much Bring Me the Horizon really want to pull from a very specific early 2000s revival of alternative metal and nu metal. There's just not the same low-end swing to it. Outside of the occasional pop trap touch or off-kilter diversions like through Ludens, it feels very heavy on the surface, but more oversold texture than real foundation. And it's very telling that when they collaborated with Baby Metal, a band that can actually convincingly deliver that full-force aggro vibe in the low end, the grooves are given way more emphasis and we get one of the more kinetic and fun songs here. But fun also seems like the last thing Bring Me the Horizon and specifically Ollie Sykes have on their mind, as this album leans very hard on all the apocalyptic imagery, but I struggle to say it's got much in the way of focus or truly cutting subject matter in favor of more video game references or the same anti-social media message curdling in nihilism that I've been hearing for years now. It's more just edgy sloganeering than depth, even with the back and forth with Mother Nature that they got on the closing track with Amy Lee. And you know what, that is fine. It's pop metal. It doesn't have to be all that deep, but it's also way more style than genuine impact, and for me, this style rarely clicks when the in-your-face hooks don't have a lot of the meat to back them up. And I won't deny that part of this is me growing up in an era that clearly inspired a lot of the metal on this album, which might get some of that nostalgic bum, but I also remember this being done a fair bit better in that time too. So really just extremely light 6 out of 10 just for the fans, only because Amy Lee and Baby Metal save this from being considerably worse. Next up from Busta Rhymes, Extinction Level Event 2, The Wrath of God.
Nigga fuck with me, jail music for riots, catch this buck 50, fuck the place up till I turn 160.
I think a lot of hip-hop critics dance around the Busta Rhymes conversation because it's not an easy one to have, because he falls in the category of being a pretty damn impressive and expressive rapper that many of us really like, and he will argue he makes songs better, but he's also one that tends to be muscled out of the conversations of great acclaim or the GOATs because many think he doesn't have a classic album. Now, there's also a conversation that he shows people up on some guest verses simply for being such an overwhelmingly strong presence that rarely pulls back, but I actually took the time to go back through his catalog to validate the whole no classics argument, and well, it's messy. Partially because Busta Rhymes has never had a well-structured album as per the era. They all run long and they could use a lot of cuts. And by the time we get to the 2000s, a lot of it has not aged well, especially in his production. Honestly, his early albums are not bad, but they're very much of their time and cannot sustain their sprawl. And thus, while Extinction Level Event has some certain late 90s charm for a certain very aggro scene in the MOP Bowl, I would probably recommend the compilation Total Devastation as being a much more digestible picture of Busta Rhymes' impact. Also, will save you from most of his bad output that came out after 2002, because wow, it got bad. Okay, his first project in a long time. What do we get with this? Honestly, for taking this many years to put out a sequel to an album that many considered his best, it's a Busta Rhymes project, for better and worse, and I'm not sure it's a net positive. It was a lot easier to overlook the considerable flaws in being way too long, with an oversold intro and outro, having some really thin synth choices on production. It just tanks the song with Anderson .Paak, which is just wrong, and all the whole conspiratorial framing devices, when it felt like Busta Rhymes was not resting on laurels as an elder statesman with his legacy secure and Chris Rock hollering as his hype man. Which, you know what, if it contributed to a more mature or introspective Busta Rhymes, that would be one thing. But this is not a Fonte or Little Brother album that will embrace more maturity or a little less oversold machismo. And if all the goofy affectations on Strap Yourself Down, or how often he references farting won't convince you, pairing the expected Louis Farrakhan content with his own unfortunate complaining on the title track might just get there if you care. Now look, the benefit of framing yourself as an elder statesman with clout is that it'll often be enough to nab big guest stars and samples. The prominent Jackson 5 samples, the Poison flip on Out of My Mind with Del Biv DeVoe, and a lot of fun even if the synth had no body, which is pretty much the same case with the Mariah Carey collab on Where I Belong. Thankfully way better on You Will Never Find Another Me with Mary J. Blige, which I also like. Then you had the slow burn groove on Don't Go with Q-Tip. That was fantastic. Preem's production was great on True Indeed. And Busta collaborating with Kendrick, it was everything it needed to be, especially against that Jackson 5 sample. Hell, I even kind of like the lush horns from Terrence Martin on his song with Rick Ross. And Ross's verse was actually pretty good. But overall, if this comeback serves everything, it's a reintroduction to Busta Rhymes' formula on albums. A little bit more expensive, but where the flaws are more glaring in contrast, especially to this time, which leads to a good but patchy project. Not a great one. So it's a 6 out of 10, worth at least one listen to reacquaint yourself, but just saying, that might be enough. Next up from Sam Smith, Love Goes.
Never gonna move in dark ways. Baby, you're so cruel. My diamonds leave with you.
Well, at least we got it. But the more alarming question might be who actually has paid attention to this. Between the delayed release and getting immediately overshadowed by Ariana Grande or even Busta Rhymes' comeback, it seems like Sam Smith got really overshadowed, even despite Diamonds being a great single. Hell, most of the singles that they released were really good. I like Dancing with a Stranger, and I think that How Did You Sleep aged pretty well. It honestly grew on me. But if there is an artist whose team has really struggled to build organic traction outside of his fan base and the radio and label system, it is Sam Smith. And a reworked or troubled production probably did not help his momentum, and yet having heard Love Goes, and I should stress I'm not listening to the deluxe edition that had all the old singles tacked on, I'm struggling to wonder what the fuss was all about. See, I've never actually reviewed a Sam Smith album before, more just hearing his singles on Billboard Breakdown, but now having heard said albums, while there's been a steady improvement giving them a little more groove and slightly less drippy material, their projects tend to have a formula. A few upbeat dance cuts if we're lucky, maybe your hit or miss genre experimentation, and then the ballads that they will range between decently affecting and histrionic or really messy, with production that for as expensive as it can sound should be way more consistent, and writing that nearly always centers a lot of relationship melodrama and a ton of bottom energy, coupled with poor sequencing, and you can get albums that can feel kind of like a slog. And you would think with all the time and revision, Sam Smith would have something different here, but no, Love Goes, it's part of the formula. Yes, on average I think it's a little better. Diamonds is the best single they've released in recent memory, and I like how Sam Smith is approaching post-breakup pain with a little bit more verve and maturity, both in the content and a lot of their peculiar brand of falsetto, but this is absolutely a front-loaded album, and it has similar problems to previous Sam Smith projects. For example, that Burna Boy collab, it's got some really nice Spanish guitar, but let's be real, it's a pretty phoned-in verse, and it's a damn shame that a lot of the organic touches on that song didn't spill over into the other mixes that feel as chilly as these do outside of the closing track. Perfume Genius, this is not. Not to mention how the second half of the album is a switch back into the spare piano ballad territory that we have heard so many times before. It's not new for Sam Smith. And look, that's not guaranteed to be bad. Forgive Myself, it's an excellent song for its raw honesty about self-care post-breakup. But then you get the trumpets and the orchestration with Labyrinth on the title track. It is so poorly mixed and thin, it sounds imported from an AJR album, and again, not a compliment. But as a whole, I find it hard to blame Sam Smith for this because it's an album strangled by a messy release in a rough year, but outside of a few snippets, that release wound up being more interesting than the album we got, which is just decent. So 6 out of 10, Man, I wish they'd get some new management soon. And finally, from Ariana Grande, Position.
Kitchen and I'm in a better room. I don't need a lift, they say I'm jumping through hoops. I'm out of love, infinite, nothing I wouldn't do, but I won't do. Searching for
Funny, I thought I'd have enough material to make a solo review of the album, only to discover that while Positions might be an improvement on Thank You Next, it does not really give me that much to say. It's one of those projects that gets better, but is a little less interesting for its consistency, and that it doesn't have the shocking low points of previous albums, but also might not have the snapshots of brilliance or ambition that really grab you here. A title track being the lead-off single, pretty obvious clue that Republic might have been struggling to really pick the single, especially as Ariana Grande is big enough that you can't really lead with a collab in the same way. But you know, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Ariana Grande leading into her R&B side, that she can have some real potential there, and she's absolutely coming into her own as a singer. She's gotten a lot of the Mariah Carey comparisons her entire career, but this is probably the first album that has the feel of the looser, more organic Mariah albums in the 90s that are among her best. Although Ariana's backdrop, it's a little pluckier, leaning a lot more on strings behind all the trap percussion. Shame all that trap percussion still feels pretty damn frail and synthetic, especially a lot of the blubbery 808 kicks. Can somebody please get this woman a live drummer to work with her at some point? My god. The more interesting percussion on Safety Net with Ty Dolla $ign, it's a big factor to why that song works. But what it also does expose is that outside of a lot of Ariana's lush vocal arrangements, the actual instrumental tunes she's working with are pretty spare. Kind of a shame, because the more lush arrangements on My Hair and Love Language, they show just how much they would actually complement her and show how a little bit more production attention or gloss could really put her over the top. And POV, in a lot of that arrangement, it might be the best closer she's ever put together. Now, that's not saying minimalism can't work with a song as glittering or playfully sexy as Nasty, or the drippy Spare Elegance playing opposite The Weeknd, playing very coy on Off the Table, because the two of them still have great chemistry. No, it's not better than Love Me Harder, but not much is. But it also might explain why this album does start to run together for the album cuts. Now, granted, it's not helped by the content, which I wish there was a little more to. It's not a good look to tell off everyone who had criticisms of Thank You Next, Ariana, especially when a lot of them were valid. The album was already critically acclaimed, so why do you care? And even more so, why are you opening your project like this? But most of the album circles either a blissed out flex or the tentative steps in finding comfort in a relationship, which, given Ariana Grande's history, makes sense why she's hesitating. There's still a lot of weight on her mind. It's one reason why Off the Table is so good, because The Weeknd understands their history, and he's matured too in how he references it. I just wish more of that detail was consistent on the rest of the album, or I didn't have the feeling that she was coasting through a lot of these cuts. But again, it ties back to something I said on Billboard Breakdown a few days ago. I gravitate more towards pop that tries maybe a little too hard, and music so effortless doesn't hold me in the same way, even if it's frequently beautiful, or even if Ariana Grande is overflowing with talent. And thus for me, it's a good return to form, but it feels a little thin. Probably will be seen as a lighter entry in her catalog. It's not better than Sweetener in my opinion, and I don't think it's got as many killer highlights as her best, but I did like this. It's a 7 out of 10. If you want to hear it, check it out. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I understand this went long, and I probably said many a controversial thing, but there's great albums worth checking out. You should do that. And hell, if you got things to say to me, comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in helping support the channel, or maybe putting albums on my schedule, link to my Patreon right over there. Friendly reminder, you don't have to. It's one of those times it's tough out there for everyone. Believe me, I get it. But hey, if you want to invest, there's the opportunity. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.